Okay, well, good morning everybody and welcome to the public assurance meeting on Thursday the 25th of November. It is good to see everybody in the virtual room, and we'll make a start with any apologies, if we can do that first.
Yeah, I've had apologies from Malcolm Birch, the Chief Executive of the OPCC. Excellent.
And item 2 is welcome and introduction. Well, I obviously welcome everybody here today. By way of introduction, I think what I would like to just cover is we, in the last few days, have had a national conference with all PCCs and Chief Constables sort of taking part in one way or another, either virtually or physically in the room. And what we wanted to do when we put the agenda together for that was really face some of the stark challenges that policing faces at the moment, particularly around violence against women and girls and tackling some of the challenges there, but also about disparity both within policing, but also the challenges of policing all the various communities across the country that they have to police in a legitimate way. And it's fair to say I think the conference was a really good success. The feedback we've had from independent people such as Zoe Billingham, who used to be our sort of inspector from HMI CFRS, was that it was a very good couple of days where we really did work hard to try and get to grips with some of those very difficult subjects. And I think it always makes you reflect on how that affects things locally. And I know these are all areas that the Chief and I have discussed many times, and in particular the need to make sure that the workforce is reflective of the community it serves, to make sure that beyond that the training and the support for all of the various officers and staff across the organisation, and whatever differences they bring, which adds to the value of Lincolnshire Police, but making sure that we support them through their journey as they join, but then ongoing through the organisation. And I know that as we look at budget setting moving forward, that's going to feature certainly in the plans for Lincolnshire, which is great to see. But in addition, the work around particularly the area of violence against women and girls, and how as a community, not just Lincolnshire Police, but as a community of organisations and residents, how we can all come together to change some of those societal attitudes to actually prevent some of the corrosive behaviours that ultimately can lead to violence against women and girls, but also some of the specific things we can do to make sure that, one, the house is in order in and of itself, to make sure that we're getting things right internally, but also externally, how we can provide confidence to the community that you know, things are being policed in the best possible way to tackle these challenges. And one of the things that I intend to do before Christmas to help support me to work with the force and also connect to the public along this is that I will be looking to appoint a new Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner, and part of that remit that I will expect from them will be to work closely with the force to actually help support, deliver on some of this agenda, to make sure that we've got that connectivity internally, but also that it's outward facing and that we're listening to our communities. So that's something that we will hit the ground running with for next year, but I thought it was important just to mention that work was ongoing, and I know how passionate you are, Chief, about these areas of work as well, so I'm sure it's something we'll be working closely together on. But following on from that, I think that leads nicely into the sort of meat of the meeting. Have we got any public questions this time, Aubrey?
No, Mark, we've had no public questions submitted.
Okay, in which case we will move on into our focus report, which is a progress update for the violence against women and girls work that the force is undertaking. So over to you, Chief.
Okay, thank you. I think this is where I introduce Martyn Parker, who's going to give us an overview and explain exactly where we are. So Martyn, over to you.
Morning all, thank you, Chief. So where we are currently is obviously a lot of national focus and local media focus, quite rightly, around the subject of violence against women and girls. In terms of a national perspective, they've clearly set out under DCC Maggie Blythe what the requirements are on a national perspective, from a national view, in terms of what needs to be delivered. You know, looking at what is that support around victims and survivors, and making sure they have the appropriate quality and support, building and increasing on the ensuring that we effectively reduce and pursuit and disruption of adult perpetrators, making sure that policing has both the capability and the capacity to really focus on being victim aware, but also perpetrator centric. And also the third national element is around that longer term investment and ambition that will reduce the prevalence of violence against women and girls, which starts with, you know, education, culture, change, but making sure we're all active and in part of that. The MPCC have appointed, as I said, DCC Maggie Blythe to lead on the violence against women and girls work stream. We are waiting for the signed off national strategy to come from the MPCC. We have it in draft and not able yet to share, but we are closely aligning our activities with that draft and also the national footprint. The force have appointed temporary ACC Chris Davison, who will lead on policing the response to violence against women and girls, and he leads on the local policing and partnerships work streams. So our approach in Lincolnshire is really trying to base on 3 strands. So what we want to do is clearly set out what our definition is around violence against women and girls. So that's those offences that are disproportionately affecting harm or causing harm and indignity to women and girls. And these offences include, and not exclusively centre around, domestic violence, including female genital mutilation and so-called honour abuse, rape, sexual abuse, stalking and harassment. And if I can give you some kind of justifications why those offences are disproportionately, when we look at our data, 70% of victims of domestic abuse are females within this county. 84% of victims within sexual violence in this county are female. And then when you look at the offending profile or the perpetrator profile of those victims, 93% of sexual offences are male offenders and 78% of domestic abuse offences are male offenders. So you can see why this group, those elements of DA and sexual violence sit within the violence against women and girls. So policing, so in terms of our local priorities, we're looking to tier things under 3 pillars, for the want of a better word. So we're looking to relentlessly pursue offenders, we're looking to create safer spaces within Lincolnshire, and we're looking then ultimately to improve trust and confidence of our communities, those people who visit our communities and those people that work within our communities. We will seek to do this under a structure of a structured performance process, so which will ultimately feed into the Force Performance Board that's chaired by the Deputy Chief Constable, Mr. Harwin. As I said, that the strategic lead will be the temporary ACC, Mr. Davison. He will link in with external stakeholders, you know, significantly the Safer Lincolnshire Partnership and the Office of Police Crime and Commissioner. He will be deputised by the Head of Crime as a supportive role, and then supported as a strategic to tactical conduit by the Public Protection Lead Detective Superintendent and also the area superintendents. And I think that's really clear and sets out how important the force have focused on violence against women and girls, that the 3 operational superintendents who hold both the resources, the budget and the allocation of tasks and activities sits across the East Command, the West Command and the Public Protection Command. And I think that's a really important step for the force to show that they are providing that oversight and strategic leadership in the right places. So that will then translate down to tactical leads in terms of the separation of the three areas that we've kind of highlighted as wanting to focus on within violence against women and girls. So the DCIs that sit under the superintendents will take responsibility for stalking and harassment, tactical lead, and they'll own the delivery plan and the improvement plans around that. The tactical lead for domestic abuse, again, will be an area DCI, and the rape and serious sexual offences tactical lead will sit under the PVP DCI. So again, they will have the resources and own the action plans, being supported strategically and through our continuous improvement department as a formalised project and programme of work to ensure that activities are delivered and improvements are met. So under relentlessly pursuing offenders, the work can be summarised in a number of things, and these tie into a number of the national reviews that have been completed by HMIC, specifically around police's response to violence against women and girls, and also a duty to protect violence against women and girls. All of those have been considered and embedded into some of the activities that we are looking to fulfil. So again, looking at that, better use of protection orders and breach identifications, improved perpetrator programs, improved crime investigations, improved focus on perpetrators and identification, training of staff, maximising of funding opportunities, and making sure we have an evidence-based approach to what works. And then certainly benchmarking our current position to show that actually all the added value that we're putting in has made a difference and will make a change and will improve the lives of people who live, work and visit Lincolnshire. Under our Creating Safer Space work, we're committed to obtain a community's view of fear of violence. We're committed to improving online prevention capabilities. We want joined up and shared partnership data because we recognise that 1 in 5 domestic abuse violence victims will report to police, but will report to other areas of social care or other partners. And we need to make sure we've got a joined up approach and knowledge in terms of that information. Want to work to support our community groups to identify their concerns, again maximising funding opportunities, and again evidence-based approach to what works, benchmarking where we are, and ensure that sexual harassment training is delivered to door staff, recognising that they are sometimes the first port of call to a victim that's reporting. Hopefully this activity that we're doing will improve that trust and confidence within policing, but can be summarised in making sure that our violence against women and girls internal standards review to make sure that we are held up by the highest standards possible, and our staff internally recognise the importance around violence against women and girls and how their behaviour drives behaviour, and making sure that internally we're projecting a positive image externally. We need to make sure we're victim focused and our commissioned services are victim focused, and that all of our staff and all of our partners understand those routes to commissioned services and the pathways, and making sure that it's not a postcode lottery within Lincolnshire and actually everybody is receiving this service that they require and need to the highest standard. We want to maximise those positive media opportunities, and we're developing a media strategy to enable us to do this. And then we'll also introduce a violence against women and girls victim survey. And again, maximising those funding opportunities, identifying the impact of our alcohol around violence against women and girls. And then also, are there any hidden groups that we are missing within Lincolnshire that we should be hearing the voice of, and those victims, ensuring that we're doing that. So there's a précis of the activity of where we want to get to and what we want to do. And obviously there's a lot of work already ongoing within the violence against women in workspace to enable us to meet those objectives. And just very briefly, they are working jointly with CPS around our joint national action plan around serious sexual offences and rapes. Obviously mentioned already the duty to protect action plan, which very much is centred around ensuring that police forces are utilising legislation correctly around bail, voluntary attendance, releasing people under investigation, ensuring that we've got a route to identify and increase our non-molestation order processes and how we are robustly enforcing and reviewing those. ensuring that we better use domestic violence protective notice and orders and domestic violence disclosure schemes. Also, the policing, the element around the HMIC police response, which mainly centres around the Chief Constable ensuring that he is committed to the commitment to deal with violence against women and girls, ensure that the Chief Constable will pursue and disrupt the adult perpetrators, and making sure that we have got the structures in place. And I hope from this short briefing that you'll see that, one, the Chief is wholly committed to this, two, that we've started to put those structures and find structures in place and find the funding to make sure we have an impact, and that we've got a real focus in terms of our quality that we're providing around investigations. So some of the practical stuff around rape scrutiny panels, we've created an independent panel that will review our investigations into rape. That will meet on a quarterly basis and has gone live this month. The OPC successfully bid into the Safer Streets Fund, obtaining £400,000 awarded. So really positive. So it just shows that early commitment to get ourselves into that. We're looking to uplift the number of staff that we have in our public protection departments who focus on rape and serious sexual offences, and provide them with greater support so we can get cases and files through the court and the criminal justice process more effectively. And then also looking to increase our use of domestic violence disclosure schemes and domestic violence public protection notices. Just by way of an example, we've already seen an increase in our domestic violence disclosure scheme requests through all of 2020 and 2021. 653 requests were recorded into the force. So far within 2021 to 2022, so that's April through to now November, we've already received 511 requests. So the activity, the knowledge and the understanding of how important the domestic violence disclosure scheme is already improved in terms of our officers' awareness and providing support to victims and ensuring they are being disclosed to at the appropriate time. So we really start to see an impact on that. So we are reviewing our crime outcomes for rapes to ensure that the victims' needs are met and to ensure that we've maximised every opportunity. I've clearly talked earlier about the realigning of our portfolio and responsibilities, and also we're going to look to get specialist training in place for officers around adult sexual violence investigations. And also we're looking to introduce the domestic abuse matters training, which we will roll out in the force to all frontline supervisors, all frontline staff, to all TEOs, to all force control room staff, to ensure that we deliver the highest standard of response to victims of domestic abuse. And that will roll out between January 2020 and January 2022 and October 2022. So that's kind of some of a broad brush in terms of some of the work that we are doing. With some of the funding that we've got, we've managed to uplift our child independent sexual violence advocacy and our independent sexual violence advisors and independent domestic violence advisors. So you'll see there's been a lot of activity and a lot of financial investment in supporting the victims of violence against women's activities. There's plenty of future work planned in terms of what the force is doing with their partnerships and how we ensure that we are working together collectively through the delivery of our plans. So I will leave it there as an introduction to the huge amount of work that's taken place that sits the force in a really good position in understanding where we currently are, understanding what we want to achieve, and then have a plan of action that will see the delivery of that plan. I'll leave it there, Commissioner, if there's any questions.
No, thank you for that, Martyn. That was really helpful and very clear. I suppose a couple of bits from me. Firstly, obviously, we can tell by some of the statistics that it's clearly evident that the areas that we're talking about disproportionately affect women, and it's predominantly male violence upon women. We can see that in there, and we know that there's a whole raft of things we need to do societally as well as from a police point of view. But nevertheless, there is a significant number of people that are experiencing domestic abuse, for example, that are not women. And I would like to think that your improved processes and practices will help across the board. So I just, you know, want to sort of hear from you on that as well, because obviously, although the focus of this report is clearly about the violence against women and girls, I'm assuming that it will have that wider impact as well. Is that right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Commissioner. So, you know, so if we think about all the upskilling in terms of officer training, we think about all the upskilling in terms of our improved processes of ensuring we've got the right victim pathways for services, all of the investment in services that I've mentioned doesn't just lean towards the victims or the female victims. All of those process and admin will support the wider domestic abuse and rape and sexual violence footprint within the force, and will also benefit those male victims as well. You're on mute, Commissioner.
Thank you. I knew it would happen at some point. From a public point of view, people obviously want to know, well, what's going to look and feel different? How will this improve things? And ultimately, I guess it's a terrible situation if somebody needs this service ever in their life, and obviously we would hope that as few people as possible ultimately need to contact the police because of this, but nevertheless, when they do, they want to feel that assurance that everything is in place. So understanding that timeline, it was useful to understand around the training particularly, and that's something that I'll be interested in sort of seeing whether we're on track with as we go through the year, because I think that's going to be really important to make sure that everybody gets that training in as thorough a way as possible and in as timely a way as possible, so that the public can be assured that the force is keeping up with that. Has anybody got any other questions that they would wish to raise on this paper? I'm not seeing any hands. So it's from my point of view, I think it's a really a good paper in the sense that it outlines an awful lot of work that's already going on, a lot of activity that's going on, and I think it's obviously a theme that we're going to keep coming back to, and I'm confident that what we will see is the force go from strength to strength in this. I've got a couple of questions in the same area of business, but I'll come to those in the integrated performance report because they're more related to that. So on that, Martyn, I'll say thank you for the report, and we will move on to our next agenda item. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm just pulling the agenda up. So our next item is the integrated performance report. So is that back to you, Chief?
It is back to me, Commissioner. Thank you. And I'd just like to echo your thanks to Martyn for all the work that's going on here, and the team that have pulled that together around VORG. It has been a really good piece of work, but I know it's been very difficult and a busy period for them on top of everything else that's going on. So thank you to all of them, and to Chris Davison for his leadership on that as well. In terms of the integrated performance report, we'll kind of share some of this out between myself and the DCC and ACC, Kerrin Wilson. But if I start with the effectiveness piece, you can see the dashboard at the top there on the page 3, all looking pretty positive, but the caveat is really that we're still looking at COVID impact on a rolling 12 months. We're starting to see quite a lot of that impact now waning. And we're starting to see a number of areas where performance is starting to go back to, or crime figures and antisocial behaviour figures are starting to go back to where we would expect them pre-COVID. But at the moment, in terms of all crime, we've seen a decrease over the past 12 months of 6%. That's just over 3,000 crimes. The more significant one probably is the ONS figures released in November, because that does start to pick up some of the changes that we've seen. Decrease of 9% compared to an England and Wales average decrease of 3%. So that seems to put us in a pretty positive position. I think there's still work to do around how we cap that rise that we've seen through the summer, and we try and suppress any rise back to pre-COVID levels. But that's work that Jason, I know, is working through in the performance boards with the area commanders and the crime command teams. The good news here as well is around the violence against the person piece. you can see there that that's dropping, particularly violence against the person with injury. That would be where we would expect our focus to be. And again, the ONS figures alongside our own figures are showing a decrease of 5% compared to an England, sorry, my computer screen is just locked up, compared to an increase in the rest of England and Wales of 8%. We have seen a spike though since lockdown ended. And if you look at those charts, you can see that at the point lockdown ends and we hit the summer months, there is that very sharp rise, kind of going back to where we were. But overall, we're still down on where we used to be, and what we've got to do is try and keep that suppressed. So in terms of where we're at with all of this, I'm pretty happy. There is work to do, as I say, to make sure that those trends that show upwards are continuing that we're getting on top of them. And some of those increases in spikes of offending are being identified at local performance meetings. So when you look at theft and theft of vehicles, in July to October, we saw 23 thefts of Ford Transit vans, predominantly across Boston and South Holland. There's now Operation Developed, which is targeting that. And whilst we expect the overall crime to reduce over the winter period, there are some offences that we would think will rise, and they're particularly around those that Martyn's just been talking about in terms of violence against women and girls. I think some of that will be a natural rise in those offences. Some of it will be because we're encouraging more and better reporting and more open reporting, and I don't think we should be frightened of seeing that rise. I think I would see that as a positive. We will see domestic abuse rise in the winter months. It's a natural seasonal trend that we see, but obviously a lot of work going in there about targeting the perpetrators, but also doing the kind of victim care piece and trying to lift people out of that position of vulnerability. And then sexual offences and stalking and harassment are the kind of offences that we would see rising in those months. But again, the work that we're doing around VAUG hopefully will curb some of that, but will also encourage people to step forward and tell us when previously they may not have done. Just lifting up from the violence reduction unit piece, obviously a violence reduction unit, there are a number of forces around the country who've been given funding for that. Lincolnshire sadly didn't get the VRU piece, but we are looking to introduce a violence reduction unit, as you know, and are supporting with funding. So I think that's going to have a huge impact in terms of our overall performance in keeping people safe, and the work that's going on with public health to determine what violence issues are in Lincolnshire and making recommendations around the reduction coordinator and how the unit will perform. So I think that's a step change in our approach in the coming year in terms of tackling violence. Positive outcomes, there are some challenges still around the courts, but we'll come to that a little bit later. And as you've heard from Martyn, we're looking to use some of our out of court disposals and protection orders and prevention notices more effectively than we might have been doing. And actually that's an appropriate shift, because that means we're going into prevention and protection rather than reaction and prosecution. And I'd rather see people kept safe than come to harm and us have to chase the perpetrators afterwards. There's a huge piece as well going on around our crime standards. You know that we have pressure around national crime recording standards, but it's also about our investigative standards. So at this point, because Kerrin's been doing quite a lot of work on this, so I don't want to steal her thunder. So Kerrin, if you'd just like to cover the crime standards element that's at the end of the kind of Chief's commentary, if you can, please.
Yes, thanks, Chief. So in relation to the crime standards team, we've recognised that there's certain areas in terms of our investigative capability and proportionate investigation that we have right across the force. So to try and bring that together and have a consistent approach from the centre so that we can share that best practice and raise our standards of investigations up, we've set a crime standards team in place. We're still busy recruiting into that team at the moment, and so it's still early days in terms of the outcomes that they're delivering on, but the impact that this will have will raise those investigative standards and the outcomes that the Chief's already talked about right across the board. So there's 3 particular areas that we're looking at within the crime standards team that we need to invest in, and that's investing in our investigators, ensuring that we've got the right continuous professional development, that they've got the right accreditations, but also that we have the well-being of investigators considered. They deal with some of the most complex investigations, and they take that emotional toll quite significantly on those investigators, and we see this nationally. So Lincolnshire's not alone in this, and we see this nationally, that there's about 5,000 investigators short across the country. So there's a huge amount of work that we're doing here, and I've actually got the national lead for professionalising investigation programme as well. So I'm taking that best practice from the national other forces are doing and implementing that here in Lincolnshire. And one of those areas that we've seen increasing is the direct entry investigators. So some of our recruitment campaigns have brought in some people who want to be investigators, and they've come from investigative backgrounds from other organisations as well, and we're able to use their skills and bring them in. But we've set that up within that investing in the investigators side of things. The second area about compliance and learning, as you'll read from the document, we've set a number of audits in place where we've got key particular crimes or key areas of focus, and we have a team that will go in and dip sample that to see where the particular issues are that we need to address, and then roll out some best practice so that we can improve those areas. So it's not tarring everything with the same brush, it's actually really pinpointing down to the areas of focus that we need to concentrate on, and that really makes sure that we're effective in our national crime recording standards. So as you know, we do get the crime data integrity review from Her Majesty's Inspectorate, and we need to ensure that our compliance with that is really at the highest standards, because this is what gives confidence to our communities that we are recording crime appropriately and accurately. This also links into the outcomes, and I know the Chief's already talked about the positive outcomes there, and we are nowhere near where we would want to be in terms of our positive outcomes for the crimes that we are dealing with. And this will really focus on the outcome 16, which it says in the report. And so what we're talking about here is where we've got where we don't have the evidence to take forward a prosecution. And that's either because the victim does not want to support the prosecution, or that we've got evidential difficulties, and we really need to get better on both of those areas to make sure that we're taking offenders to justice, and then we're getting that justice for all of our communities, and that way we can start and really address the reoffending rates as well. And then the third area is about those criminal justice improvements, and that's about the national file standards and also the victims' codes of practice. And I think we'll, I don't know if we're going to come on to victims updates later on in the report here, so I'll just concentrate on the file standards at the moment. We've got some really good file standards in certain areas, but that's not the same right across the board. So when we talk about our rape victims and the files that go through court at the moment, we are the highest quality across the whole of the region. However, we don't get enough through, so we need to really unpick why we're not sending enough through, but making sure that the quality is there for all of those. But also the file standards we've introduced in this particular team, things like evidence review officers, who will be an extra gatekeeper to give that additional support to some of our frontline staff, certainly around domestic abuse and hate crime, which are some of the higher priorities for us. And we've seen the quality of those investigations and the quality of those files going through to be a much higher standard since we've put that measure in place. So that's a snapshot of what the crime standards team are doing, and they will get better at it as we get more resources in there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kerrin. I'll just carry on through this section and then we'll pause if there's any questions. So the other pieces I'd pick up on here is drug offences. In this report you can see drug offences or possession of have dropped, but an increase in drug trafficking offences. There's a couple of reasons for this. Is Firstly, the results of Operation Merlin, which was a covert operation against drug dealers around the county. We know that that's depleted the market. We know that there will be a gap left for the time being, and people will come back in and fill that gap unless we can prevent that. But that has had an impact on actually availability, but also those people who are out purchasing drugs as well. And that's been the normal trend actually in any operation that's been run in any county over the past 2 years. And then we are focusing much more on the drug trafficking elements, so the county lines elements rather than the people in possession. So how do we actually take out the organisers and the runners of the lines and protect the vulnerable people at the end of it? Good news in terms of antisocial behaviour, we're starting to see that come down again. It still shows an increase, but you can see on the chart there that's largely due to COVID offences, and you can see that massive spike that happened when new offences came in and we had all the antisocial behaviour orders and the COVID orders going out. So we're starting to see that return, but there is still a COVID impact there, and we will continue to enforce against COVID issues if we see the need to do so, particularly as the infection rates start to rise. And the final piece is really around the crime harm index. You can see that starting to rise now, but that generally relates to high harm offences and increase in demand. But we also have an increase in homicide over the past 12 months. Whilst that may sound dramatic, it does have an impact on the crime harm index, but they're tiny numbers. Our normal murder rate is around 7 or 8 per year, and we're looking at three extra at the moment. Very difficult to prevent and predict, but they do have a kind of disproportionate impact on some of our indexes. In terms of road traffic collisions and driving enforcement, you can see as lockdown came out, we've had an increase in killed and seriously injured, but we're still running below where we would expect things to be. Traffic has increased. We saw significant volumes coming across to the coast during the summer months, but there has been a lot of enforcement, and as you know, Commissioner, we're looking to bring in a dedicated roads policing unit. Recruitment for that is actually underway, and people have been identified, and we're just starting to establish those positions. And there's some performance figures at the bottom there around the activity that's been going on for speeding, seatbelts, mobile phones, drink driving, and the dangerous driving, as well as vehicle seizures. So a lot of proactive work going on there, and a real ambition to try and get that pretty static 55 deaths per year down in the coming 2 or 3 years, and make sure that we keep focusing on protecting lives and preventing those KSI incidents happening. So firearms licensing remains a real positive for us, and we are kind of leading light really in firearms licensing, so I won't dwell on that. Obviously we need to think about how that's going to work as we go through the G4S transition, but we have plans in place for that. And then forensics analysis, I'm just going to hand over to the DCC to talk about this, and the scenes attended and where we're at the moment. So Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Chief. Thank you very much. I think this conversation links into the bit that Kerrin touched on earlier on around outcomes, because forensics recovery is a key element of identifying suspects. So we do recognise, if you look at the raw data in this report, it doesn't give a particularly rosy picture in terms of how many we're actually attending. Now, the important bit here is we don't need CSIs to attend every crime scene, because firstly, some of the crime scenes have gone, because actually it's offences that have occurred a while ago and reported late. Some of it's also the fact is they're likely to get a evidential benefit from attending that scene is less likely as well. So one of the things that we do organisationally is firstly part of our recruit training and obviously ongoing CPD with our staff is reminding them about best evidence, forensics awareness, and therefore when they go to a scene they help make the assessment of is it appropriate for a CSI to attend. Now what we have done here and we continue to do is do deep dives, because if you look at it generally overall it's very low numbers attending, but there's clearly certain crime types that there is clearly more likely to be a forensic opportunity than others. So burglary is one that I'll always raise. So if you look at our last quarter's data, we attend around about anything between 20 to 25% of all burglary dwellings. And then we look at commercial burglaries, it's again around about just short of 20% we attend. And out of those, most of them we get identification. The issue is always sometimes that could be people that have legitimate access to those premises. But in terms of identifying suspects, those that we believe are committing the offence, we get around about 10% out of all those that we attend to. So the message is, in terms of quality, we look at quality and getting the best evidence at the scene. It's not that we're not saying that every scene there might not be evidence, but looking at our assessments that need to be done, because the reality is with the limited resource we have around CSIs, we still get a good yield in terms of that capability. And actually, again, if you compare us to other parts of the county, whilst they may send their CSIs to a lot more, they're getting less positive results. So we are focused very much on the quality here, but I do recognise, and again, certainly for reporting, going forward with the PAM, we will break this down into crime types as well, because I think that's important. It's about public reassurance. If you're a victim of burglary particularly, it's a very personal crime, and the reality is that is one where we know we are more likely to get some kind of evidential benefit from a CSI attending the scene. So it is work in progress, links into the wider conversation about getting and then identifying those that are responsible and the outcomes piece, and it links into the wider bit of our continuing professional development of our staff regarding their role within CSI and forensic recovery as well.
Okay, thank you, Jason. So we'll pause there because that takes us to the end of that section. Are there any questions on any of that?
No, thank you for that, and that has covered a lot of ground and put a lot of additional meat onto the bone of the report. So thank you for that. I've got a few bits. I mean, in no particular order, because we've obviously covered quite a lot of ground there. With sexual offences in particular, the level of sexual offences seems to be higher at the moment than we would normally experience at this time of year. And again, I appreciate that could equally be more reporting, but I suppose the question is, do you feel that there is an issue there that we need any additional focus on? And in particular, I mean, one of the things that comes through is when we look at the national figures, and I know these things are always emotive, but as it's in the report, it states that we're 19th nationally when it comes to this area of reporting, which seems particularly high for a rural county. And I don't know who the other 18 are that are sort of worse, if you like, in that sense, but it would be interesting to sort of get your take on that. And I'll give you another question at the same time rather than just one at a time. Around the drug offences, obviously, from my point of view, I think focusing on the trafficking makes eminent sense. That really is good to see. Obviously, from a public perception point of view, it could be perceived as worrying that they see sort of arrest for possession going down, and I think you've covered off the reason why for that, but I guess it's as we move forward, do you expect that to continue? Do you think that will rebalance as you say somebody fills that gap in the market? How do you sort of predict what might happen in that space?
Okay, thanks, Commissioner. If I take the first one and then I'll give Kerrin and Martyn a bit of thinking time I'll take the second one and then Martyn and Kerrin a bit of thinking time on the rate piece, but I'll cover some of that as well. So I'm speaking from experience as DCC and MSU before I came here and running these types of operations across all 5 counties. In all of those operations, we've seen that gap in the market occur after we've run the operation against the organisers, against the county lines. And the challenge to each of the police forces then is actually how do you prevent people coming in and filling that gap in the next 3 to 4 months? Where there's been an effective neighbourhood response to it, and we've managed it, and forces have kept that preventative and visible presence, you don't see that gap being filled rapidly. It does slowly come back, but not in the volumes that it has done previously. Where forces didn't think about that, which was in the early days, you see that gap being filled very, very quickly by the organised crime groups because they just rebuild their structures. So it is something that we're watching. It is something that I know from a local policing point of view, the neighbourhood teams and the local senior leadership teams are keeping an eye on, and we have got that presence there to try and stop it. But history tells us and evidence tells us that over time people will try and exploit that gap, and we just need to keep watching it. In terms of the sexual offences, I think there's a couple of ways of looking at this. Is high reporting to me at the moment, I think, is a positive thing, because it tells us that there's confidence in our systems, and it tells us that people are willing to come forward and speak to the police about it. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that everybody has that confidence, and I think there is still a huge amount of work we can do, which Martyn touched on in his VORG presentation. But I wouldn't get too worried really about where we sit, and it's probably the one area where I don't really want to see us being the lowest numbers in the country, because it would almost lead to some perverse outcomes and perverse reporting. We need to be encouraging reporting, and where we should really be focusing is on the piece Martyn's already touched on, which is around the positive outcomes and the prosecutions, and how do we take more of these cases to a positive outcome and a prosecution in court with the CPS, or we have appropriate care and diversionary tactics put in place depending on the type of offence that the victim and the perpetrators are confident about, and keeps people safe in the longer term. So I know Jason's got his hand up, so I'll pause and let Jason come in, and then if anybody else has anything, they can come in from there.
Colleagues would expect me to want to come in on the drugs conversation, wouldn't you? So, Commissioner, you've got the proposed strategy with your office at the minute for feedback for next week. I know Joe and the team's been heavily involved in that. Important is about whole system. So yes, we need to, and we are very focused, as the data shows, around those supplying. That doesn't mean those that's in possession get away with it. It's not about that for me, because they still commit a criminal offence, and ultimately their need is driving the supply, which obviously has the wider impact on serious violence and everything else. What we are doing as a part of the strategy, though, is joining up. So if we do come across a person that's in possession of drugs, a low level amount of drugs, and actually has been no previous contact with the police, they need to be diverted into relevant alcohol disposal. At the minute, they're not, and that's not right. That's not the way we'll actually reduce offending longer term. Evidence base shows us that. At the same time, we've just secured some funding around drug testing on arrest, so we go live with drug testing on arrest in the county in the new year, which again helps us, those that we identify that as a positive test, they'll also be going to treatment services. They don't comply with that, straight away they commit an offence and therefore go into the criminal justice process. So again, certainly a clear message from our side is look, the drugs we know drives activity, without going over the data we talked about before. The reality is it's got to be a whole system. Again, the county have secured extra £500,000 this last 12 months to get extra more capability into the treatment services for criminal justice outcomes. There is more work we need to do with the courts. If you look at the amount of drug referral rehabilitation notices is very low. Again, that's not unique to Lincolnshire, it's a national issue. And the reality is we're trying to increase those numbers. But what we are trying to do here is to make it very clear is drugs will not be tolerated in the county. But in this, to me, must be joined up. It's not about going for the easy targets, those that's in possession. We need to stop the supply. And whilst we're stopping the supply, as the Chief touched on there, we start to reduce the need because we engage treatment services to try and address the issues why people are taking drugs in the first place. The wider challenge is we know people don't take drugs in isolation. They'll be associated with alcohol misuse. It'll be linking to mental health. So one of the bits of work we are doing through the join up strategy is about how we deal with all the dual diagnosis, and therefore not a case of just because you've got a mental health issue, we can't deal with your drugs issue. Or if you've got a drugs issue, we can't deal with your mental health. That's not right. That's not where we should be. And again, certainly in terms of commissioning services, public health are very excited on that and are looking at their commissioning services around.
No, thank you for that, Jason.
Should I just come in a little bit to add on to what the Chief's already said about the sexual offences and your question, Commissioner, around the levels and being 19th in the country, etc. I think it's important just to recognise that traditionally we get a lot of sexual offences from holidaymakers, and because of the influx of holidaymakers in the summertime, we do see, linked to the nighttime economy, we do see those increases in the county. But I do fully support the Chief's view that we want to encourage sexual offending reporting, and we do see that less tolerant of what might have traditionally have been, oh, it just happens within the marriage and I'm not reporting it. So when we do get those domestic abuse referrals that come through to us, we're much better at unpicking some of that historic offending as well. and so we will crime those. So lots of these offences will be that we've picked out through some of that multiple criming that we see when we go and visit victims.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I can see Martyn, you want to come in.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. There's probably just a third strand to that, and it surrounds the work that we're doing within schools and the university. We've obviously got a dedicated officer now assigned to the university, and where we've historically not necessarily recorded all of the sexual offences that have previously been committed in educational establishments in the past, we certainly are now, and we're doing far more work around that now, because we need to understand those trends and the effects that they have both in the educational institutes, both schools and universities, and then what we can do around education prevention so they don't become either the perpetrators or the victims of the future. And when I talked about this, education's got a big involvement in the changing of the culture of violence against women and girls and male perpetration. And actually we're doing far more work within schools and within education, but that is tending to lead to more reporting as well, which, as the Chief said, at this stage is a positive element within that part of the VORG work that we're doing.
No, thank you for that. And yeah, it will be interesting to see the work of that direct link with the university and what actual change we see as a result. Will it lead to more reporting? Will it change to, you know, a different set of outcomes? It'll be interesting to see, and that's something I think in the future we'll come back to. Certainly regarding Jason's point around drugs and the need for appropriate interventions for people that are often very vulnerable themselves and are using drugs, I totally agree. We need to make sure that the system works across the board, and in particular where mental health is also a challenge, which is something we'll come on to a little bit later in the report. That's a particular issue, and obviously this will directly dovetail into what in the beating crime plan would come under the family of neighbourhood crimes. Generally, some of those that we see more prolific crimes, whether it's shop theft, vehicle crime, robbery, where a percentage will be linked through to trying to gain money for substance misuse. I think it will be interesting to see how the new strategy, the new drug strategy, will directly link to hopefully seeing reduction in those crime types, because obviously we want fewer victims of crime as a result of appropriately dealing with vulnerable people who are in need of treatment. So, you know, I think that's going to be something that I will want to focus on, how those two have a relationship together. But I totally am on board with everything you say about the need to have appropriate services in place to support people at the time they need it, not 6 months later, but at the time they need it.
So just on that metrics, Commissioner, that is one of the metrics in the new accountability and delivery framework developed by the Combating Misuse Drugs Unit. So again, it'll not just be for policing, it'll be with the wider probation and everybody else to report on that metric. And again, there's only the conversation this last 24 hours is about how we're going to manage that, because it's going to be reported locally, which again goes back to our data quality issue. We need to make sure we're identifying drugs as a driver for some of our activities, not just drugs, but in terms of mental health and alcohol as well. But yeah, it's very much on the front and centre of reporting.
Excellent. Another question I've got was around the file quality piece that Kerrin, you were talking to, and one of the challenges there, I suppose, is how sustainable the improvements are. Is it a case of, because obviously the introduction of a gatekeeping system is quite labour intensive, and I would hope that will lead then to improvements in the file quality at source. So is that the plan? Is, you know, what's the longer term vision for that? Is it that we will not need the gatekeepers, or that they're a permanent fixture?
I certainly hope they're not going to be a permanent fixture. It is about improving the here and now, but that longer term piece is about identifying and working with our line managers or sergeants or custody sergeants or inspectors to have that supervisory oversight so that they get better at what they should be checking, because we've got quite a young workforce And so we need to make sure that we're constantly on top of that to give them the skills and ability to do that. And we're doing a lot of crime cafes right across the county at the moment, working with sergeants, working with frontline officers and working with the control room about what the evidence levels need to be within our files, but also in that capture of the investigations. So the evidence review officers, yes, they're a gatekeeper at the moment for some particular crime types, but that learning should be disseminated right across all of those supervisors. And it may well be that we keep the gatekeepers in place for a period of time because they will have particular focus for different crime types as we go on and as we get better and improve. But the majority, what I don't see is that we would introduce and have this established layer there that we take away that responsibility for the sergeants to do what they should be doing.
Thank you. Chief?
Yeah, I think the other point I'd make on this as well is whilst we wouldn't want them to be a permanent feature, we need to recognise the difficulties we've had around the AG6 guidance and also the new charging standards that have come in, and then we've got Bail Act changes coming in April next year. These all add to the complexity of the files and the work that's required, and I think the simple view from policing is that the AG6 and the new charging standards don't work from a policing and investigative point of view or from a victim point of view. They happen to manage capacity going into CPS and the courts, but they're not really delivering an appropriate outcome for victims. And what we're seeing is more and more time taken to try and get hold of CPS and files being sent with action plans, which basically delays things for 28 days, 56 days or even longer in a number of cases. That is a piece of work that Nick Fgrave, one of my colleagues, is working on from the NPCC point of view. And there are 6 forces, I think, that have been looked at, and there will be feedback going in for the review around the AG6 and the charging standards. Whether it will make any difference to us or not is another matter. But it is an area that I think as the Commissioner you can have some, or you can help us with around that, the impact on resourcing, cost and the political direction that's being given around whether we want a perfect system or whether we want perfect justice, because I'm not sure we've got the balance right between the two at the moment.
No, and I think on that point, I know it's been raised many times at national levels, and it continues to be a topic of conversation because there's no force that isn't affected by this. And I know that the ministers are discussing this. So I'm sure they'll be looking at the outcomes of those 6 forces that are being looked at closely to ensure that the balance is right. So I am hopeful that we will see some changes at a national level to make that more manageable, because it does seem to be quite a significant change without any benefits for the public, but it does seem to have managed a workload for one part of the system, which has just shunted everything onto everybody else. So it doesn't seem to be an appropriate system at the moment, but yeah, we'll keep on pushing at that. But that was all I've got on that particular section of the report.
Okay, thank you. In which case we move into effectiveness, where I'll hand over to ACC Wilson, because a large part of this is within her portfolio. So Kerrin, over to you.
Thank you. I think if I can just take you through the predominantly around the call handling and the call handling figures that we have so far, and on to where we are with 999 calls. So we've seen significant increases in call demand to where we were at the beginning of the year. So 999 calls in January and February were roughly 6,000 a month, and we're on 9,000 to 10,000 a month now, and that has been consistent right the way through the summer. So we've had significant increases. The 101 calls, although they haven't had that significant increase, what we have seen is that because of our focus on the 999 calls, we have not been as effective in answering the 101 calls as we had done previously. So we roughly were back in January 10,000 calls a month. 14,000 calls a month of 101s, and that's been consistent all the way through. However, our call handling has significantly dropped for the 101s throughout the year. Right throughout the summer, some of the demand that we were seeing was equivalent to what we would see on New Year's Eve or really busy public holidays, and they were in midweek. So that was completely unusual to how we were receiving this demand coming through to us. We've put in quite a number of measures to try and mitigate some of this demand. One of the areas that we introduced in the summertime was the online crime recording, and we'd introduced it much earlier, but we really pushed to try and channel shift some of that demand to the online crime recording, and that has resulted in I think it's about 60% increase in crime recording this month online to what we would normally have. But that has also meant that people who are waiting on the 101 call line, they will get the message about reporting online, and we've monitored some of that. And so our abandonment rate for 101s is quite significant now. So we get roughly 2,000 to 3,000 calls a month of abandonment on the 101 line. And I'm really confident that a lot of them have been channel shifted to the online reporting. The 999 abandonment rate is still in single figures, and so I'm really comfortable with that, despite the huge increases in numbers of calls that we are getting now. So I'm comfortable that we're still getting to the calls that we need, and that we are getting to deal with the 999s as effectively as we should be. It's still around about 92% of our call handling in the 10 seconds. Nationally, the figure that most forces go for their approval rate is 90%, so we're over that. We have dipped from time to time on odd days, but that's not significant for the 999s. Throughout the summer, we've had COVID, we've had challenges with new recruits coming into the call room and training them up, and the COVID impact has been quite significant because, as you can imagine, that's a lot of people in one room. We have considered splitting the room as we did last year throughout the summer, but actually that wouldn't have made a huge amount of difference. We put a lot more measures in place to make sure that the environment is as secure as it can be, but we do see a lot of sickness rates within the control room. So the other thing that I just want to flag up is about our call handling times. So whenever people ring into the control room, we've introduced Thrive, which is assessing the threat, harm, investigative and risk issues for those individuals on the phone. And what we don't want to do is take a call really quickly and then pass it on to somebody else, and then pass it on to somebody else, and pass it on to somebody else. What we want to do is make sure that when people ring in, we give them the very best service that we can. We unpick all of those vulnerability factors at that one point of call. But that does mean that our call handling times is longer. So we're on the phone longer while we're unpicking all of this, but we're giving a much better service because it's much more victim focused at that point. And this is, I'm really emphasising this particular bit because, as we know, the government's beaten crime plan does have included in their beaten crime plan call handling times. And we can see some perverse behaviours if we just purely focus on how quickly we actually pick the phone up. Because if we pick the phone up quickly, but then pass it on to somebody else, that victim focus is not going to be at the centre of what we're doing there. The resource and shift review, which is ongoing at the moment as well, is also having a look at all of our resources on the front line to make sure that we can get the right people in the right place at the right time. So that is mirroring where our demand comes in. We do see the nighttime economy starting to bubble up now, so we have got plans in place right throughout December to make sure that we've got the right levels of resources in place, especially for the next 3 Fridays in December, which are traditionally very, very busy for the county, making sure that we've got those in place, not just within the control room, but our uniform response, or CID response, or vulnerability response, specialist operations, etc., are all increased, or levels of numbers there, to make sure that we're on hand to be able to deal with that demand as it comes in. The other particular area that we are looking at as well is making sure that we've got the right levels of support for domestic abuse throughout the winter, because that does come in quite significantly through that holiday period as well. We see those increases there, so we've got additional resources in there. And the final thing in terms of that additional focus throughout December is on drink and drug driving. So we've got a particular campaign that we work with the NPCC on, to make sure that we've got that going throughout the winter as well. So there's some of the areas of focus on there. I know it's not just about response times and call handling times. I've expanded a little bit on there, but hopefully that's added some benefit for you there, Commissioner.
Yeah, thank you for that. And one of the things that I'm fortunate enough to be able to deal with the Minister on, through being the chair of the APCC, was around the Beating Crime Plan and the implementation around what will be monitored for call handling. And you're right, they're keen to sort of understand what's going on across the country regarding that, because there's a strength of feeling that the public should be able to expect a similar standard of call handling times across the piece. And one of the challenges that we've made abundantly clear is the fact that it's also taking into account the fact that if you can deal with somebody's inquiry once properly, and they then don't need to call back in or need another call back, or they don't need somebody to actually go and visit them because they're happy, they're satisfied that their issue has been resolved, then that is worth an additional 30 seconds on the phone, a minute on the phone, to have achieved that. So it cannot be purely about how quickly we can get people off the phone. We know full well that the complexity of calls is getting to be more so. We know that from not just how many calls you're taking, but how long they're taking to handle it. And we need to make sure that any measures that are put in nationally reflect all of that, the complexity, but actually the satisfaction, if you like, of the public in what happened on those calls. And that makes it a much more complex thing to measure, but it would be pointless, quite frankly, to just measure how many calls you took and how quickly you got people off the phone. That wouldn't be of any value to me. I don't think it would be of value to the public, and it certainly I don't think would be of value to you. So I'll make way for the Chief at this point, because I can see you've got your hand up, Chief.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. It's just to re-emphasise the point you've made, really, about the complexity of the calls coming in and the nature of the calls, because we're seeing more and more calls that I wouldn't say are traditional police calls. They're more health, mental health, and other public service calls. And I think part of that is around accessibility to those other services. It's also about a growing push towards online reporting rather than being able to speak to a human being. And we still remain one of the few services that has that dedicated control room and call handling infrastructure that is open and easily accessible. I know we're working towards better online reporting and there's real developments there, but the complexity of some of those calls coming in is partly because we're seeing calls for other services ending up in the police call handling element. The other piece I'd say about that timing as well is that time to take and resolve a call, as you rightly say, can be worth much more than the 30 seconds that you might lose by not answering another call, but it's also about saving life. And I had the pleasure a couple of weeks ago of writing to one of our call handlers who spent 2 hours talking to a mentally ill person who was about to take his own life and jump off a bridge. If she hadn't spent that 2 hours talking to him while we could locate him and find him and get help to him, I have no doubt he would have taken his own life. If we put our call handlers under time pressure and performance figures around time alone, that kind of care and attention and willingness to spend time on the phone at I've no doubt some significant emotional cost to the call handler as well, that simply wouldn't happen. And we would be looking to move that call on as quickly as we could to a response team who aren't able to speak to that person and aren't and have no idea where they are, and we may be looking at lives lost. And I would never ever, as a Chief Constable, want to put my frontline staff and officers in that kind of position where they have to make a call between somebody's life and safety and a perverse target.
I mean, the good news is you will always have an ally in me in that respect. I would never be pushing for you to hit a false target in that way. That would never be an issue. So regardless of whether the targets ultimately work in the way that I think ministers genuinely want them to be positive and supportive and helpful, if they end up for whatever reason not quite achieving that, then I would rather that we're delivering for the residents of Lincolnshire and we can justify that than we're hitting some arbitrary target set at a national level, which doesn't necessarily take into account those local needs. So I would always be local first, as I know you would want to be. And on that, I mean, just talking about the mental health issues in particular, one of the things that and forgive me, my memory isn't always the best, but I seem to recall that back in 2016 we were having around 450 uses of the Section 136 power in a 12-month period. We're now up to, I think it says in the report there, 692 in a similar period, and I think that's been a constant growth, and that's a really significant concern. As a resident, I'm concerned that that level of issue in around people's mental health exists, but also the time pressure that puts on the force, particularly given that what we're sending to deal with people in mental health crisis are police officers who aren't trained in mental health crisis, because obviously they aren't health workers, they are police officers. Although I accept you do deliver some first aid training around mental health, primarily this is a health matter, and it does remain a concern for me as to how, as a system, not just policing, this is going to be addressed. And I'm aware there's additional funding coming into the county, which is looking to spend funding both providing units, residential units over in Boston and other benefits, but it still remains a concern for me, particularly around transportation, because the expectation from me would be that the ambulance service would have the right transport and timely available transport at that to be able to transport people in mental health crisis. The back of a police vehicle is not conducive to aiding somebody's mental well-being when what they need is healthcare rather than putting in a police cell. So I remain committed to helping you sort of raise that with partners, and I do think it is something that we really need to get a handle on as to where we're going societally around mental health, because I don't think it's a Lincolnshire issue. I think this is a national issue. And Jason, you wanted to come in?
So one of the options you could do, Commissioner, you could call a mental health summit, couldn't you, within the county, just to bring all the partners together to have that conversation around your concerns. And because I know for a fact, if Chris was here and we had the conversation at COP only last week, there is some energy, which is really good in the county to address some of the issues. There's some plans in place, some short term, but the reality of this all goes back to longer term planning. Because again, if you look at the stories of the individuals that's involved, a lot of the individuals should never have come in contact with the police service and are coming in contact now, and some are getting criminalised because they are committing criminal offences and have the capacity to commit those criminal offences. And the reality is because the early intervention work that needs to be done across the county is not where it needs to be. And again, that's not just unique to Lincolnshire, it is a national issue at the moment. So certainly from my side, I think I'll be very supportive. If you said you wanted to pull partners together to have that conversation and the impact it has on communities, not just in terms of criminality, but vulnerability, because that's the key issue, I think that would be very beneficial at the moment.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. And I think there's another element. We have got a meeting in the diary, which is an ambulance discussion with partners, and I think again it wants raising there about the correct transport, and I'm certainly not pointing the finger at EMAS to suggest they're not working exceptionally hard. We all know how hard they work, but it's making sure that they've got the right tools to do their job, and that's important in then making sure that you know, the other services have got the ability to get on with their jobs as well. So that's something that we can raise there, but it's certainly something I think we will pick up with partners around the mental health piece, because I think it is really important that we review and we work together to do the best we possibly can. And even the fact that we do have mental health professionals working out of the control room is a signifier of our commitment to help the system, but also the fact that health recognise, as they contribute to that as well, that there is a burden put upon policing. So it's not news to anybody that that's the case, but ultimately it's about what's going to deliver the best outcome for residents who, like you say, are very vulnerable, and often the police turning up is not going to de-escalate the situation and help. So it's not in anybody's benefit. So yeah, we will take something away with that, and certainly look more closely at what we can do. Pulling up my details. So on here, just on something else you mentioned, Kerrin, around domestic abuse. Did you say that there is a planned Christmas campaign? I picked up that there was about the drink driving, but is that also the case around DA?
Yes, we've looked at our resources across a range of different particular areas, such as the roads policing, etc. But DA is one of them. And Martyn, I'm going to potentially put you on the spot here, because you may well know more of the detail about how we're actually rolling this out. But we are looking at the additional resources and also the communication campaign about DA.
Yeah, Kerrin, that's right. So we start a pre-Christmas 16-day of action campaign. I think it's around the 3rd of December, which does a 16-day preemptive. That's with all the partners. So that's led by the SLP and the DA board out of the SLP, of which we're obviously a member of that. And then we do something over the actual.
Could I just stop you for a second? If you could put those wonderful acronyms into words for me. Yes. I'm just conscious that there are members of the public who might be interested in your fine words. That would be really helpful.
Yeah, so the Safer Lincolnshire Partnership, so under the Domestic Abuse Board, sits under the Safer Lincolnshire Partnership within the local county council, Lincolnshire County Council, and we have a combined partnership plan across a number of partnerships or a number of bodies within the partnership to commit to the 16-day of action campaign against domestic abuse. That has a media strategy, that has an engagement strategy, that then has a kind of enforcement strategy and a prevention one as well. So we all work to the same elements. And then Lincolnshire Police, over the Christmas period, where we know that it's our DA spikes, we look about our enforcement, our prevention, where are our resources, targeting those repeat and serial perpetrators. So someone who has repeatedly committed domestic abuse, or a serial perpetrator who has repeatedly committed domestic abuse against different victims, and we enforce and make sure that we do extra work around our DV, our domestic violence protection notices, and our domestic violence disclosure screens, and we commit resources to that.
That's great, thank you. I fully support that, and will help spread the word, because I think it is really, really important that we, are really clear in our aims and ambitions to try and highlight the issue around domestic abuse, but also to get people to come forward and know that, the support is available, because it is a very difficult time of year for families, as we know. One final question on this section before we move on, which is just really, are there any plans around the increased use of restorative justice? We've sort of seen it stall a little bit of late, and I'm really keen that for certain victims of crime, it's an exceptionally valuable sort of way of supporting them to get closure and move on, and also work around alternative diversionary routes, because I know there's a lot that we've discussed in this space, so it'd be useful to just hear a bit more about where we are with that.
Chief,
yeah, go on, Kerrin, if you want to pick this up.
Thanks, Commissioner. I think this links into what I was saying earlier about our crime standards team as well, and that we do need to get much more of that central oversight in what we're doing around restorative justice and other diversionary schemes. So working alongside the partnership team under Chief Superintendent Di Coulson to make sure that our integrated offender management team are as cited and supported. We have put additional resources in there in the last 12 months. The restorative justice one is a really interesting piece. We do need to push this out, and we do push it out with our frontline officers quite a lot, but it's not always the right time when the police are actually dealing with victims because things are so raw. Quite often the best restorative justice comes further down the line after a sentence has been instigated through criminal justice proceedings, etc. And we're doing some work with probation, and I know you've got the Restorative Solutions who you Commissioner, to actually deliver on that, and they do a huge amount of work, both training our staff internally, but also highlighting some of the good outcomes that we've seen come from that. But some of the areas that I think we really need to push for, and if we can use your influence in any of the circles that you're in as well, is around prisons and around probation, to actually be much more signed up to restorative solutions and restorative justice outcomes. I know we've talked a little bit about the ancillary orders such as domestic violence prevention notices, etc., and using them to make sure that some of our out of court disposals, we have those joined up as well, about how we're actually going to preempt people who might be wandering into a life of criminality and using those much more effectively. So we've got all of those ancillary orders there as a prevention tool, but we need to be much more effective of policing those prevention tools. We put a lot of energy into getting them, and sometimes this can take days and weeks to gather the evidence to get some of those prevention tools through the courts. But once we've got them, we need to make sure that we constantly police those as well. And we've got some work going on at the moment through the crime standards team about ancillary orders, and I think Martyn might correct me here, but we've got something like 2,000 ancillary orders live at the moment, right throughout the county, whether they're domestic violence prevention notices, criminal behaviour orders, antisocial behaviour orders, etc. And we're just working our way through how we're proactively going to monitor them so that people can, our neighbourhood teams or our response teams can actually understand who's got these orders out, and how we challenge ourselves to be better at policing them.
No, thank you for that. It's one of those areas of business that I think will constantly develop, and you're right, very much right about the timeliness around restorative justice, because I think there are different stages people will go through, and it's often very late in the process, often when there's been a criminal justice outcome or an outcome, that they then will potentially seek that route, and it is something we need to get better at across the partnership, and I think that's something that we can work on. Okay, that was my last question on that section.
Okay, thank you. Shall I take us to legitimacy then, Commissioner? So the key aspects in here, I'll give Kerrin a break here, and I'll kind of keep talking. Stop and search, you'll see a number of stop and searches have decreased by 5%. It's something we're looking at about the effectiveness of the use of stop and search overall. It is a constant challenge to policing about the legitimacy of the power and the proportionality of the use of the power, and you'll see in the commentary that at the moment we have a disproportionate use of stop and search on Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups, and that's particularly around the arrest rate following that at 42% compared to an average of 15% for overall in Q2. So we're just looking at that. There is really good scrutiny around all of this in terms of the IAG, the Independent Advisory Group, and we're always looking at those recommendations coming in from Her Majesty's Inspectorate around the best use of stop and search. It's a difficult one to get the balance right, particularly when we have very, very small population, BAME populations, but that disproportionality is still a little bit worrying, and we need to understand where those figures come from. And the reason I say the small numbers is because, again, similar to the homicide rates, 1 or 2 stop and searches could account for that. And we know certainly, I think we reported in the last, in one of these, maybe 2 reports ago, it was due to 1 stop and search of a vehicle that happened to have 5 people in. So the numbers can be misleading sometimes, but we do need to understand that, and we do need to make sure that we're using it effectively. The file quality element of this, I think we've already covered, so I'm not going to dwell on that. And user satisfaction is an area that I know Jason has been pushing in the performance meetings, particularly around keeping people informed. That seems to have dropped off recently. We had a bit of a dip earlier in the year. It's picked up again, but again through the summer, at the end of the summer, it's dropped again. And that satisfaction level at 56% needs to improve. And there is work ongoing around that, and each of the area commanders and crime commands are aware of that and are working on it. And again, that falls into the crime standards element of improving our investigation, improving our victim care, keeping victims informed, and making sure we're doing everything that we should be doing around the victim codes of practice as well. So it's a significant area of concern, because it obviously goes to the heart of public confidence as well. And we are working on it to demonstrate that we're looking after our victims. So I'm not going to go any further than that. We've on that part, but we have got a rise in complaints as well. Complaints reporting did change earlier in the year. But you can see a spike there now, and I'll just hand over to Jason to explain a bit of that background.
Yeah, happy to do that, Chief. So the data shows it. We saw traditionally we have 94 complaints received on average per month. Obviously went to 138. That the uplift. Again, when you look at the profile of those complaints, there's nothing different to the overall makeup of profile for other months. The issue is we've seen more increase in the overall numbers in terms of complaints regarding police contact. Commissioner, it links into the conversation that the Chief just touched on there about if we're not keeping victims updated, you can see why they then want to make a complaint. So it's the connectivity to, by wasting the system, not doing what we should be doing and what we expect, it creates more demand in the system where it gets to complaints from PSD. So we've got a plan around it. There's a 5-point plan, which again we talked about at the Force Legitimacy Board this week, and now we're doing that. And again, a lot of it goes back to, firstly, in terms of public expectation of what we can and can't do in terms of crime investigation, our response to some incidents and others that we're not, goes back to the point of we do put ourselves in space where actually we should be saying is that's not a policing matter, why are we dealing with that? But the reality is, if I'm very honest, is when you start then looking at the complaints and how many of those complaints are upheld and how many are not seen as not appropriate service, we still see 84% of all complaints are service that we'd expect. So public expectation is greater than we are actually delivering. So there is a piece of work that Suzanne's leading with the areas at the moment in terms of how do we deal better with public expectation, where their expectation of what the police can and can't do or should be doing is clearly where the police service don't do that anymore. We may have done it many years ago, but we don't do it anymore. That piece of work, we want to join it with your office. It's a conversation I've had with Malcolm already through the PSD governance meeting, which I know we've got next week again. And again, it all boils back to that initial contact. When the public contact us, do they understand what the likely response is going to be from the police, what the police can do, and importantly, what we can't do. And it's not an easy piece of work. It's a piece of work that we need to do. It's one that we need to, again, back to the 5-point plan, understanding why they're complaining. And importantly from it is how we reinforce that messaging at the earliest opportunity, and the earliest opportunities before the public actually contacts us. Because the reality is, if they don't contact us because they don't need to, then the reality is we're less likely to get a complaint. So more work's ongoing with it. Importantly, the IOPC were in, I think, had a conversation with Malcolm only yesterday in terms of how our PSD are performing. They've raised no issues in terms of our PSD, which is important, taking account of the demands on the team at the moment. But we do recognise in there, in terms of public satisfaction linked to complaints, there's more work we need to do, and that's why it's very much a front and centre focus of our force performance meeting.
Thank you, Jason. Kerrin? You're on mute, Kerrin.
Schoolgirl error. Just wanted to flag up as well that we've got the local Criminal Justice Assurance Board next week, and one of the areas of focus for that board is bringing all of our partners together from both OPCC, CPS, etc., and police to make sure that we've got the right approach to our victim support. And so I know we talk about the victims' codes of practice there and the new points that will be coming in that we will have to report on. We also link into the national group because there's a number of different elements going on at the moment with the NPCC, what they want, what the Ministry of Justice want, and what different forces want locally within their own demographics. And we're trying to pull all of that together so we've got one comprehensive report and structure about how we can measure how effective we are, and therefore we know what we're giving our victims and where we need to focus some of our attention. So that's a piece of work that's ongoing at the moment, and we'll be able to update as we go through the next couple of months as to where we're going with that.
No, thank you for that. I think that is an important area of work. I mean, everything that sort of policing locally does only sort of really gets recognised if the public are then happy with that service, and whether it's their personal service that they've received or whether it's what they hear from others about the service they've received, it has that knock-on effect. Just a couple of questions around this. One you alluded to, which was around the rising volume of complaints, whether you know, there's any kind of analysis of the kinds of complaints. I know PSD do this, but whether there's any emerging trends, anything that we should be concerned about, or whether it's just, as you said there, is it specifically around the fact that people aren't getting back to them in a timely way, or is it something else?
So Commissioner, it's a mixture of that both. Firstly, it's keeping informed, and then it's about managing expectation of the victim or that member of the public in terms of that initial contact. That is the key issues from it. So again, it's one that if you look at our last 2 quarter reports from PSD, it's the same issue. And that's why, again, the plan of, right, that gives us the theme now of what we need to do better. And importantly, it's not just in terms of, yes, we need to make sure the service is better in line with the needed expectations of the member of the public, but also recognising, again, if their expectation is greater than we can ever deliver, it's about how we manage that and not just deal with that particular case, deal with the other cases that could come further out behind it. Vehicle crime is always a prime example where people still believe we'll have CSIs going to vehicle crime and stuff like that, which we don't, because the value of doing that is just not achieved. But again, we can manage that. If we're instead of waiting for the complaint, we could be proactive to stop it in the first place by managing expectation with that first point of contact.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The managing of expectation from the outset and being clear about what is likely to happen is really important. And I had the opportunity yesterday to need the police, so I called 101 as a resident, and obviously I went through that process, and actually I'd have to say that first contact, that 101 process, worked well. I mean, yes, I was on the phone for a few minutes, but it was clear how long that I was going to be waiting, and you know, my call was handled well. What was interesting was the follow-up email that I later received, which I thought was from looking at it from the outside in, I thought, well, there's some interesting questions there for me. So the use of the term MPT in the email, well, as a resident, that literally means nothing. So I think some of the basics that policing can easily slip into, where it starts using jargon and you know, changing the expectations almost from that initial conversation through to an email that may not necessarily reflect what it actually means. I think there's some of those basics we need across the service to look at and go, well, do we need somebody who's going to look at it from a plain English point of view and say, well, if I received that, what would I feel? What would it mean to me? Because I often think that, you know, my initial thought was, well, the force are handling this is great. A simple email made me go, well, actually, are they handling it in the way that I initially thought they were? And it doesn't mean that they're not. There's lots of people working really hard, but I think sometimes just the simple wording of some of those things. So I think those kind of things need to be reviewed. Otherwise, you can add to your complaints bundle because of an automated message that goes out to somebody and changes their perception of what's going on. So I think there's an interesting piece there.
So it's again, for me, Commissioner, it's about trying to do the right thing. So it's trying to do the right thing about telling the person, but doing it the wrong way. That's the bit of it. It goes back to the conversation around standards, the reinforcement of standards, about expectation, and it goes back to actually it's about the voice of the individual, whether it be a complainant, victim, that gives us that feedback, and we regularly get that feedback and do something about it. So I'm pleased your satisfaction in first point of contact was good. That's excellent. That's in line with it. But then the follow-up bit, which is where I just touched on earlier on, is where we could do better, and that's the bit we need to do better.
And what was fascinating for me, looking at it from a resident, it was great to have the follow-up bit. It was great that within a few hours somebody was following that up. It was just, for whatever reason, the execution of it just wasn't quite on point. And I thought, well, if that's the experience of people coming through that system, then there's something we can do quite simply to improve that, and maybe that will just, you know, improve people's perception of what's actually happening, because I'm sure it's not necessarily the work that's going on that they're, you know, that in that instance they would be upset about. The only other thing I wanted to ask you, which was about the victim survey, because I know that is an area where we've been looking to make some ground for some time. Have we got any progress on that at all?
So, without sharing my frustrations with the rest of the frustrations of our Chief Officer team and yourself, Commissioner, we've come to a line in the sand. Now, again, thankfully, as Martyn said earlier on, we are doing some more targeted surveying work that we need to do around the victims of violence against women and girls. We need to do that, because actually, if you look at the pool of getting that data, that information back in, it's quite limited. What we have said at the last performance meeting last week is there's many systems, there's many ways of doing it. We recognise at the minute our current way of doing it is limited, so therefore we do need to nail our sails to the mast and agree. So at our next performance meeting, which Kerrin will be in the chair because I'm on leave, we will come back off. That's our proposal. Now, importantly, it won't be done just the force. We need to do it with you, because obviously you've got some responsibilities and can help us in terms of the reach of victims, particularly around victim services. And therefore, certainly for our next PAM, and I'll put my nails to the mast on here, at our next PAM meeting, please ask us the same question, and we will have a clear answer of what that's going to look like, when we're going to do it by, and importantly, what else is it going to give us that we're not getting at the minute, because it is limited. You know very well it's limited to certain crime types, and the reality is it's wider. Crime is only 25% of our demand. We need to look wider around victims. When I say victims, include antisocial behaviour in this as well.
No, that's great, thank you. The only other questions I've got are around the wellbeing and absence piece, which we haven't really talked about, and I don't know if that's because we haven't come to it yet, or whether we've skipped over it. So if that's the last bit on there, that's great. I'm glad that we haven't missed it out. I was suddenly thinking, have I dropped the ball there and we've missed it? But no, it's good.
Yeah, no, we've not. We're coming on to that piece next. So around the efficiency piece. So if I just rattle through that a little bit, Jason will pick up on some of the capabilities and officer uplift numbers and where we're going with that. But you can see in terms of our officer strength up to 1157, or just under 1158 actually, 924 of those being deployable, although we are having a debate at the moment around what the definition of deployable is, because we have a number of officers who may not be fully deployable but are deployed and are doing frontline duties, but maybe not necessarily out on the street. Of those on top of that 924, we've got 60 student officers out on the street as well in their tutoring phase. We know we're going to have some pressures with that in the coming year, because we're kind of loading up our recruitment for 2022, and it was something that was raised in JNCC yesterday by the Federation about, have we got enough tutors, are we going to be able to cope with it? But that is work that Jason has in hand, and Rachel Betts and Charlie Rimmer are looking at as well, so we're on top of that. I think the bits that are worrying for me is the number of working days lost per officer or per member of police staff. Both of those are showing a sharp rise. They're still kind of within boundaries that you would expect within policing, but they are almost relentlessly going up at the moment. Some of it is down to coronavirus, and we are seeing spikes in infection rates at the moment in line with the rest of the country, but a lot of it is about the pressures that our officers and staff are under, and we are seeing more and more anxiety and more stress related illnesses, And I think that's probably indicative of public service as well, as much as anything else. It has been a relentless 2 years, and then as lockdowns come, the last 4 or 5 months have been even more pressured for them. So I think we're just paying the price of some of that. Moving our health and wellbeing services back in-house in the coming year, I hope will help. And we have a crisis care line now that is much more accessible and available to many more people, and we make that available to our G4S colleagues as well, so that everybody has equal access to it. But the work that Sean Burgess is doing around this is really, and Lauren Oliver as well, just superb, and I look forward to seeing those coming in. In terms of operating model, I've mentioned the roads policing team being developed. Rural crime team is partly in place now, so there are 3 dedicated officers to that. Just to give an indication of the benefits of this, in October last year, I think we had just over 400 hair coursing incidents. This year it's been under 150. We've proactively managed to identify the vehicles that are coming in. We now have AMPR markers on those. We've seized a number of vehicles, we've seized a number of dogs, and we've been using dispersal orders effectively. And I think the real benefit to this is, although we still had the 150 or so incidents of hair coursing, we haven't seen the level of threats and violence that's been aimed against our communities and the people in the communities that we saw last year, because there are teams there. And actually those teams are engaged with Countryside Alliance, with the NFU, and are going to those meetings and listening to their concerns and trying to tackle them. So as that team grows, I can see that being more and more effective. But even with 3 there at the moment, it's already starting to have benefits. And before I come back to Jason around the officer uplift and the operating model in a bit more detail, in terms of leadership roadshows and the culture piece, I've been doing roadshows with Chris Davison, who leads on the culture for us. We've done 15 of these now, so we've hit around about half of the sergeants and inspectors. I've got 1 more to do with the chief inspectors and superintendents, and I'm doing 1 with the chief supers on the 10th of December. We've left that till now because obviously there was a promotion process to go through, but that's about resetting the force values. That's about resetting some of the leadership expectations as a relatively new chief coming in, and making sure that we have a clear leadership contract around the expectations about how we're going to lead the force and how we're going to move forward and how we're going to use those values in the future. So I will pause there and hand over to Jason, who can give you a bit more about officer uplift and officer numbers.
Thanks, Chief. Thank you very much. So in terms of the officer uplift, again, Commissioner, you'll be cited on, we've got recruitment plans in place in line with the uplift for after Christmas and then into next year. They are on track at the minute in terms of the 60 we're going to be bringing in the new year, and obviously at the same time looking to bring in some transferees. The transferee numbers at the minute don't appear to be the same levels that we initially anticipated or hoped, so there's some work that's been done around that. And obviously the key focus going into next year is that we will be required through the PQF programme to obviously bring in the new entry points in, which again, there's a piece of work being done around that at the moment. So, and significant effort going into terms of national good practice and obviously linking into the region capability as well. In terms of the operating model, the Chief's touched on it already. So we've selected those that are going to go into the rural crime team. Some are in now. Roads policing, half their team will go live in January, and all the infrastructure around that's in place. And then the rest of the roads policing team will go in later on next year, and obviously the rest of the rural crime team going in January as well. So the rural crime team will be in place this financial year, and importantly the road policing team will start and then progress from that side. This week we've put out the adverts for the new neighbourhood policing capability in terms of some more dedicated CBMs. So the obviously the community beat managers. So I'll make sure I make reference to CBMs. But the important bit is here we're putting them in there, the areas where we know we've got greater issues, greater demand, greater vulnerability, and importantly giving us that dedicated time for those individuals to work with wider partners to do some effective problem solving. We know very well that does work, makes a massive work. The work that Kerrin's been leading, mutual gain about that more dedicated capability engagement with communities to make them not just more resilient, but understanding and address their local issue is part of the role the CBMs are going to do as well. So certainly from our side, we're on track with the uplift. We are monitoring retention. Again, every force in the country will be, we've got people leaving because, again, the profile of recruit 30 years ago we're on that edge of the 70s, sorry, into the 90s. And importantly, from that side, again, we're looking at the retention of student officers as well, because the challenge is great bringing new people in, but as we're seeing some join and don't really know what they're joining. And secondly, is in terms of, are they hitting the standards? Because what we can't afford to do is let them loose with the public if we don't think they're safe to do that, both for their own safety and the wider safety. So there is some significant focus on that at the minute, not just locally, but nationally as well, to make sure we're getting the right quality, recognising the speed of recruitment as well. So I think that's the main bits for me, unless there's any questions.
Thank you very much for that. Just a couple of questions. I mean, you've answered a couple of the things that were concerning me, particularly about rising absence levels, which obviously is a concern, and you've discussed the element around where we are on the sort of repatriation around the wellbeing service, because I think that will have an impact. I mean, it's clear that there's obviously going to be a higher number of young in service frontline officers than we've seen in a very, very long time. And I think the question there is around, well, will we retain, how will we retain, the training requirements moving forward, all of those kind of elements that I know you're thinking about. But what would be useful, and we'll deal with this offline largely. I've got a couple of questions about changing the report, but one of the things it would be useful if on the dashboard we potentially could include the length of service across the frontline officers as an indicator, so that we can articulate some of that, because what we're sort of seeing is some information about that, but actually seeing that would be really helpful, I think. Okay. Okay, the only other element around the uplift programme is obviously our contribution to the ROCU model, which is part of the uplift programme, and there's always a challenge just purely out of geography around some of those roles. Do you envisage it being a concern, or is that something that across the region we can manage with partners?
So I think from my point of view, Commissioner, I don't see that as a big concern, and in fact I would positively encourage us to make sure that we have our officers and staff in there, and then we uphold our part of the deal, but actually it improves our access to those specialist services if we have our own people in there, because we get better knowledge and better connections and better networks, and actually we've seen some of that, I think, simply by having Nikki Mayo in there as a Chief Superintendent. That connectivity with the force just makes a huge difference. So I don't think it's challenged us in the past, and actually quite a lot of what Paul Gibson over in EMSU is talking about is a kind of hub and spoke model, rather than it having to be everything into the centre. So even if we've got geographic issues, the likelihood is that they're going to be locally based but working to an EMSU command team. You're on mute, Commissioner. You're still muted.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to say thank you. That concludes all of the questions on the report, and I think that's given us a really good rounded sort of understanding of what's going on across the force at the moment, and the plans that you've got in place regarding some of those areas that you want to improve. And you know, rest assured, the areas that we think we can work closer together on a national level to change, we will do so. And on that note, there has been a couple of things that have been pleasing to come through. A year ago, I corralled PCCs to join a letter that I wrote to ministers urging them to include in as early a legislation as possible the banning of virginity tests. And we're talking about violence against women and girls, and this is one of the areas that I was very pleased to see is going to actually change as part of new legislation. So it's sometimes those kind of conversations we have and letters we write sometimes can take a little while before we see anything change, but it's great to see that sometimes they do. So, you know, I look forward to continuing those kind of conversations to change the national agenda as well as what we're doing locally. But no, I haven't got no more question on that. Is there anything else you want to raise before we conclude the meeting? Okay, so I'm now going to put Aubrey on the spot and say, have you got a date for the next meeting, Aubrey?
We have indeed, Commissioner. It's Monday, the 7th of March.
Wonderful. So 7th of March, so we'll be almost at Easter. We'll have eaten turkey and got that out of the way. But thank you very much for everybody for joining us today, and we'll bring the meeting to a close. Thank you very much.